Hi and welcome to another tutorial from Hums, and today we're looking at the top 10 tools you must know if you want to do motion graphic design in Blender. Now, one of the most infamous situations a newcomer can deal with when coming into Blender is that all-encompassing, that all-engulfing 3D viewpoint and that three-dimensional axis control. You are given so much control that it's very difficult to even know where you are or how to position yourself to where you want to go, or even to determine your own orientation. The tool I'm going to present to you today, in my opinion, is the best tool in Blender for granular positional control in Blender, and that tool is the snap tool. Good. And today we're going to be looking at the snap menu, and we're going to be looking at the snap transformation. Okay, so we're in the 3D Blender view here with a default scene. We've got a cube in the center here. We won't be deleting the cube because we'll be using it to explain the different snapping options. Good, so there are two ways to access the snapping options. The first way is via the menu, the traditional route, and that's you go to Object, you go to Snap, and then you go over and select which option you're looking for. Good, the second option is a shortcut, and that shortcut is Shift and S, and you're greeted with this circular option panel in front of you, where you can pick each option, or you can hit a number, you see the number to the right, to activate the option once you're in this menu. Cool. This is how you get into Snap. So the next thing we need to talk about Snap is the anchor points that we can snap to. So typically when dealing with a snap, you're snapping one object to another, or one thing to another place, and you need to know which anchor points you are allowed to snap towards, right? Because this is what gives us the control, basically where these anchor points are. So the first anchor point that we have is the active, and the active is when we select something and we see that it's in this bright orange. Good. This bright orange is the anchor point. Is the active, sorry, and one of the first anchor point we're talking to. Good. The second one is selected. Now if we duplicate this with Shift and D, let's just move this along the x-axis here. Good. This is selected, but if we select this box as well, we notice that both of these are selected. So in this instance, the selected would be the medium, or the median would be a calculation of the medium between these two objects here. So wherever it snaps to will be the center of these two objects. If you select active, it will only be this box here that's in the bright orange, or if we shift it, this box to the front to the bright orange. Wherever the brighter orange is present, that is where the active will send whatever you choose to snap to. That's the anchor point for it. Cool. After that we have the grid, and the grid is the floor that we see here. There's also a Z grid, but it's not shown in here because that would be an infinitesimal amount of them, and it would be difficult to see, but you can imagine there's a Z grid as well. So what's happening here is that if the box is not in an integer location, or is in a location that is not akin to the grid, it will move it to the nearest grid point. So if I say move this along the Y a bit, move it off kilter, off center a bit, and we hit Shift S, and we say selection to grid, I think we have that. Yeah, selection to grid here. We can see it moves slightly over, so that it's now, the anchor point is now aligned to the grid. Cool. And in all points, the anchor point is choosing the center of this volume cube, right? You can actually choose different places to snap to on the cube to an anchor point, but we will get to that point in a bit. So everything is to the center. Cool. So the next one after grid is the world origin. Now the world origin is where the X, Y, and Z guidelines meet. Now you can't see the Z right now because it's not enabled. If you go to the overlay, we can enable it up here with Z, and we can see the Z line coming straight down. So where all of these meet is the world origin. Good. So if I put the cursor here and I say Shift and S, and we say cursor to world origin, it will move it to the center here. Good. And by default, the cube, by default scene, the cube is always in the world origin. So we can move this over, select it to cursor, and you see the cube is now in the world origin. Good. So this is the world origin. And I think the last one is the 3D cursor. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the 3D cursor, because the 3D cursor is a point that you can move anywhere around in the 3D viewport. It's this dotted red and white circle that has a crosshairs in between it. Good. We're going to talk more about this, but this is the 3D cursor if we place, so we can actually snap to the location of the 3D cursor. Cool. So these are your anchor points. Good. And we've also taken a look at some of the options in the snap menu. We've looked at the world origin. We've looked at selection to cursor. Let's take a look at some others. So we're going to move from selection to cursor. So let's go ahead and just move this here. And we see that our cursors here. We're going to move our cursor to the world origin, and then we're going to select section to cursor, and we see that it moves it over there to where the cursor was. Right. Let's go ahead and choose the next one, which is selection to cursor keep offset, and we notice it does the same thing. So why do we have two different options but it does the same thing? Well, the difference applies between these two options when you look at moving element objects in edit mode. So if we go into edit mode by pressing tab, good, or we can go to edit mode up here in the top left, it shows us our vertices, right? Because we have the vertices option by default here as select mode. Now what this means is that when we apply the snap option now to the cursor, instead of moving the entire object as an entire one object, it's going to move the individual vertices. So what happens here is that when I go to selection to cursor, all the vertices collapse on themselves to the cursor point, and thus the integrity or the original shape of the object is no longer intact. Good. This is actually a great option for shape keys, which I'll discuss in a bit, but this may not be what you want. You may want it to move to the cursor, but you want it to retain the shape. So to do that, all you have to do is select the next option, which is selection to cursor keep offset. And again, this will use the center of the cube as the movement vector, and it will keep all of the vertices in the same place, thus in keeping the integrity, the original integrity of the shape. Alright then. So the next one here is we've done grid, we've done world origin. Let's take a look at cursor to selected. Now we don't just have the option of moving things to the cursor. We can move things. We can move the cursor to things, right? So what we can do here is we want this cursor, wherever it is, to move towards this active object. So we can say cursor to selected. Good. And this should move the cursor to the selected point. Is the origin not in the middle? Let me check it. Objects, the origin to volume. Let's go again. Okay. Select this, cursor to selected. Right. So look like the origin point wasn't in the middle. So what this will do is remove the cursor to the selected point. All of it is relative to where the origin point of that object is. So you have to make sure the origin point is in the center, or else you'll get different results like you saw I did just a while ago. Good. Let's go ahead and duplicate this and use and just before we do this, let's try cursor to active. Good. So cursor selective, try cursor to active. We see you get the same result, but if we go ahead and select these two together and go cursor to selected, we notice that the cursor goes in the middle, which is the median point between the two. However, if we go cursor to active, it moves over to where the active orange box highlighted it. So I mentioned this earlier, This is the difference between active and selected. Good. Alright. You can also have the selection move to an active. So if we have these two selected, but I want the two of them together, alright, we can say selection to active, and now that box is in the center of this box. So if I move it down again, you can see here they're in the center here. Good. And that concludes the different types of snap options in the snap menu. Right, so this is incredibly useful, especially for shape keys. You want things to collapse in a shape key. You want them to disappear, you know, and you're saying, okay, I really want things to disappear here. I can select this vertice, I can say cursor to selected, and I can go into my shape keys here. Good. And I can select everything here and deselect this part here, and I can go ahead and say, oh, it's in the same edit mode, sorry. We can say Shift S here, and we can say excuse me, selection to cursor, and then we see that it collapses on itself. The shape key records this, and now we have a scale here, you know, that also acts as a little pivot point. Something to keep in mind, right? Very useful for that type of purpose. Cool, so we're gonna move on to snap transform. Okay, so we're on to the 3D cursor. Now the 3D cursor is not necessarily part of the snap tool set, but we need to understand what the 3D cursor is and how it functions in order to effectively and fully use the snap tool for its granular positional control. So what is the 3D cursor? The 3D cursor is essentially location data. It's location data in the form of an icon, very similar to an empty. You cannot render the 3D cursor on screen. It is primarily data just in the form of an image. Now, even though it's similar to an empty in the way it works, it has some differences that are unique to it, right? And we're going to be talking about its main features compared when using it with the snap tool. So the first feature, and the most obvious one about the 3D cursor, is that you can place this cursor anywhere within the 3D viewport. It has free reign over the 3 dimensions of the 3D viewport, which is the X, the Y, and the Z dimension. So basically anywhere you click, I am left clicking, but you would be right clicking, most of you who are watching this, right? Anywhere you click in the 3D viewport is where this 3D cursor goes. Good, it has free reign. Which leads me into the second point. Wherever you place this 3D cursor in the 3D viewport is where the new spawn site or spawn position or birth position of new elements will be. Right? And by new elements or new objects, anything that you create will spawn in that position wherever this 3D cursor is. So to demonstrate this, we're going to hit Shift and A to access the add menu, and we're just going to go ahead and create a cube. And the cube, right, has spawned directly over the 3D cursor, where the 3D cursor now becomes the center of the cube. And you see it's the volumetric center of the cube. Good. So if we click somewhere else, and let's create an empty now, and create a sphere, we see also that the center of the empty is the 3D cursor, where the 3D cursor was located. You can see that it spawns exactly where it is. So wherever we put the cursor, that's where we get a new birth of an object when we create one. The third feature that relates to the snap tool is that the 3D cursor can be used as an anchor tool for any existing object to snap to. So we spoke about this in the last section, but we're just going to demonstrate again just to make sure that we're full on this section as well. So if I hit Shift and S to go into the snap menu, which is a shortcut, and we say selection to cursor, good, just have something selected, and we're going to say select it, selection to cursor. We can see that the object moves directly to the 3D cursor, good, with again the center of the cursor becoming the center of the object matching the center of the cursor, good. So we can see the various features of this. Now, what people don't typically know about the 3D cursor is that we can granularly control its position, right? Similar to how we control the position or location of any object with a transform matrix. The 3D cursor has its own transform matrix. And to access this matrix, we have to go over to this arrow here, go to view, and we see that we have a 3D cursor drop down option. Mine's already revealed, right, but yours may be collapsed, so you may need to click it to open it. And here we can see that we have a transform matrix for location and rotation, which tells you that the 3D cursor also has rotation data. And with this now, we can move the 3D cursor incrementally via the units of the transform matrix. We can move along the X, we can move along the Y, we can move along the Z. Good. So now we have control over a location data icon that we can snap any object to and any element. We can snap even the premature features of that element, or the primal features of that element, which is the edge and the vertex, because we looked at the vertex in the last section. We can snap a vertex to this 3D cursor. So any shape or any shape key transformation or movement or adjustment, any animation logging where you are animating the full object can be positioned with the 3D cursor and the 3D transformation matrix, which makes this, in my opinion, because I can't see anything else that does it, makes this the best tool for granular positional control in Blender. Good. And it's also a way to cut down your time if you find yourself struggling with the 3D viewport. Another useful tool that you can use in this situation also is a period key, which allows you to zoom in and zoom out to a particular point. So you can zoom in here, but already it's using the world origin as the zoom point. So you can use the period key, which is on your numpad, which it's got Dell on it, and that will, instead of using the world origin, that will use this point instead. Good. And now you allows you to move around this vertex, which gives you a bit more 3D viewport control. Cool. All right, to return the view back to the origin, you can use Shift and C. Good. So we zoom in here with the period key, hit Shift and C, and that returns it back to the origin point, and you can begin your control again. So this is the 3D cursor. We're going to move on to the transform snap options, and that's exactly what it sounds like, the snap options for the transformation of objects. And then we'll just that will complete the tutorial. Okay, so moving on the snap transform, and you can find that up here. Good. And that is the magnetic snap icon here. Click that and you have it activated, and you have a bunch of options here that you can choose from. So the first thing, you have the snap base, and this is the area within the object that you are snapping to. You can choose to snap to the closest element. You can choose to snap to the center of your element or your object. You can choose to snap to the median of an element of a set of elements, or you can choose to snap to the active. So these are the options, very similar to what we did for the snap menu, but slightly different. So let's take a look at closest. The best way to look at closest is to look at the vertice. Snap here. So we have increment on, and we're going to use closest. And essentially, if we go to Shift Z, so we can see the what is the closest here. Go to C shift dev to go to the closest. All right. When we move this, we can see that the vertex is moving or snapping towards the closest viable target of the snap condition. Good. If we say we wanted to snap to a vertex, it will begin to snap according to the closest vertex that's in its proximity. So this is the closest vertex within its proximity, therefore it will snap to that vertex. I think you can control how sensitive it is. If not, no, we may be able to, but I'm not sure. But right now we can see, I'll give a feel of how sensitive it is. Yeah, you probably can change in the preferences also. So you have the option here, and that's what the closest means. Good. All right, so we're going to take a look at the next one, which is center, and we can come out of this center for this for a bit. Let's go ahead and just hit Shift and Z here, and let me just change this back to its original unit scale. Cool. Or is it 1? I can't remember. Yeah, I think it's 1. Okay, so right now we're going to use the center as a snapping tool. Cool. Let's go ahead and just make sure we're on increment here. So we can see here that the box is moving in accordance to the grid. Now this box that comes as default is exactly 2 units by 2 units in Blender's default metric, which is the metric system. So if we go ahead and press Shift and Z, we can see the wireframe of this, and we can know that we're on the center here, and we can see that the center is what's snapping to the grid here. You can see the point here. This is what's snapping to each grid point. Good. This can also go on the Z, but we're just moving along the X and the Y. Cool. Let's take a look at the next one, which is the median. Let's go ahead and duplicate this, and let's move it across by 2 units again. Let's select both of them together and let's move them, and we see that we're also getting increment movement along. Now the medium of these 2 boxes, if I take out of Shift and Z so it's easier to see, the medium of these 2 boxes here would be the center line here. If we add these 2 up and the middle here and divide it by 2, we're going to get the center line here. So you can see every time we move the increment of the boxes, we see that the center line is the center of these 2 boxes, and that of where the increment's going to, and that is what the medium is for. Good. And last is the active. So if I change to active, it's just going to use this box as the focus of the increment target, and essentially same of what we did in the first section. Whichever item has the orange or has the brighter orange overlay. And those are the 3 anchoring point sections for the snap base. Then you have your snap target. We looked at increment. Grid is very similar to increment. We can adjust the floor grid by going over to the units. You find the units by going over to the scene icon, which is this cone and a circle. Then you go over to units, and we can increase or decrease the unit scale, thus increasing the increment amount. We can also change the system. You can use empirical. You know, if you're from America, you can use empirical if you're more used to that system. And yeah, you have different options to do different things here. Good. So for the vertex, we looked a bit at the vertex already. We can snap the vertex points here, pretty much. And from the edge now, which is slightly different, we can use an edge. So we're just going to use a selection of edges here in edit mode, and we can snap an edge basically to an increment, or let's go ahead and snap it. Yeah, we snap it to edge. So we can snap an edge essentially. It's going to snap it to the increment section by default, I think. Good. We will also target other object positions as also for its target. Cool. And that's the edge. Good. The face is also very similar to the edge in operation. Good. We can snap via face as well. And we have a bit of options here. Good for snapping. And we can also snap via the volume, so the entire volume. We can snap via the edge center, and we can snap via the perpendicular area of the edge, so where the edge matches. So basically the vertex, this point here, is where it would snap by. Yeah, we can see snapping to the perpendicular area there. So these are the options. It kind of adds a bit more it has a bit more options in terms of breaking down what you may want to snap for. These last options are more for modeling than they are for, say, motion graphics. If you go in motion graphics route, you're really looking at vertex control and face control. You may touch edge control, but not much. And you're looking at increment as well. So it really pays dividends to know those as well. We have a couple options as we go down, but this is a bit less under the snap for motion graphics. Right, some of these things can help a bit, but they're not that much more important. I will say though that you can affect not just the translation, you can affect the rotation and the scale in terms of what you choose to apply the snap tool. So it doesn't just have to be translation in terms of movement by X, Y, and Z. That way, it can be rotation, it can be scale as well. All right. And that basically is the snap tool in its glory. And this concludes the snap tool tutorial. In this tutorial, we looked at the snap menu, we looked at the 3D cursor, and we looked at the snap transformation tools. These tools help for more purpose directional control over your positioning in Blender, more granular focus control, and more comfort when working in the 3D viewport. You can find where you're going to, return to where you're coming from, and manipulate points in Blender with greater ease when you have the snap tool set under your belt. This helped me for my projects, and even in this tutorial I found things that I learned that I didn't know about prior. So, until I see you again with another tutorial, get up and design a new dawn. Later.